In this episode, I am checking out the Season 1 episode, This Side of Paradise, on Star Trek Revisited. Without any further ado, let's get into it. All right, we're starting the episode. Here's a lovely shot of the Enterprise remastered, approaching Omicron Ceti. Is it 3? Omicron Ceti 3, says the navigator, who is called Mr. Painter. We don't think we've seen him before. There's Uhura at communications. She's been trying to transmit a contact signal, but she's getting dead air. Kirk tells her to keep on trying until we've established orbit. Kirk goes over to Spock and says there's 150 people on that colony. What chance is there of survivors? And Spock says absolutely none at all. Berthold rays are deadly, and that Sandoval's group could not have survived after 3 years. And Kirk finds this hard to accept, that they went to somewhere in a place that they knew they might not survive, and Spock acknowledges that they knew it was a risk. This raises an important question. Can they afford to send people down to the planet's surface? And Spock says yes. We can afford a limited exposure, as Mr. Painter tells them that they've established standard orbit. Kirk then asks Spock to equip a landing party of 5 to accompany himself down to the planet, include Dr. McCoy and a biologist. And we cut to a lovely real outdoor scene, which is always nice to see when we're outdoors for real instead of on a set with plastic rocks. And we've got our landing party: Kirk, Spock, McCoy, Sulu. We've got Mr. DeSalle reprising his appearance, I think, for the first time since the Squire of Gothos. And I think it may be Mr. Kelowitz appearing here for the third and final time. I'm sure that he is credited in this episode from memory, but I'm not certain, so we'll keep that one open for now. But we're exploring what looks like a very, very old-fashioned farmhouse and farmland here, and it looks idyllic and peaceful, and Kirk notes this. So sad. And they came all this way and died. But hardly that, sir, says a voice. And we turn around and we see 3 men here. Welcome to Omicron Ceti 3, says the obvious leader, and he identifies himself as Elias Sandoval. All right, opening titles done. We get the name of the episode, This Side of Paradise. Beautiful orbiting shot as we get a captain's log, started 3417.3, and a recap that they thought that their mission to Omicron Ceti 3 would be an unhappy one, but instead of what they expected, no survivors, apparently the information was incorrect, as Sandoval and his 2 assistants come forward to greet our intrepid landing party, saying that our subspace radio didn't work and we didn't have anyone who could master its intricacies. And Kirk says to him, well, we didn't come here because of your silent radio. And Sandoval distracts from this. Doesn't matter why you're here. We're happy to see you. Come, let me show you our settlement. McCoy chips in at this point and says, on pure speculation and educated guess, I'd say that man is alive. And Spock confirms this planet is indeed being bombarded by Berthold rays. At this intensity, we'll be safe for about a week, if necessary. But these people shouldn't be alive. So why are they alive? And Sulu comes up with a question. Well, was it possible they're not? And McCoy says, well, you just shook hands with him. He had warm flesh. He's alive. No question on that fact. But also that Berthold rays are incontrovertible in this environment. No cures, no serums, no antidotes. If a man is exposed long enough, he dies. Simple as that. Sandoval escorts a landing party into the farmhouse, and in they go, Sulu carrying a very large bag. I've not seen anything like that before, or noticed anything like that before on a landing party. In they come to a very typical farmhouse interior from probably this sort of time. And Sandoval goes on to say that Omicron Ceti 3 is an ideal agricultural planet, and we determined not to suffer the fate of expeditions that went before them. And he's interrupted at this point by a beautiful young woman who says Elias, and her eye is immediately caught by Mr. Spock. And Spock looks back at her in obvious recognition. She's introduced as Layla Kalomi, and she indeed says that Mr. Spock and herself have met before. Now, this lady is played by a British actress called Jill Ireland, who sadly passed away very, very young. She got an illness and died quite young, but she was a a wonderful actress who, from memory, I think may have been married to Charles Bronson. We'll check that later on. The conversation continues, and Elias says that their principles here is that human beings should return to a less complicated state of life. No vehicles, no technology. We have harmony here, complete peace. And Kirk goes along with this for now. We'll try not to interfere with your work. And they're encouraged to make themselves at home. And they wander off, but Layla and Spock give each other a knowing visual exchange. And then we go to explore outside. We see Sulu and Pelowitz just hanging around the barn. Sulu hops up and perches himself on a fence, and he doesn't seem to notice a plant, a flower that's very, very obviously out of place here, as the barn is open, and it's commented that this barn isn't built for animals, just for storage. And Sulu comments here that we've not seen any animals, no horses, pigs, or even a dog. Back inside, Layla says to Sandoval she knew Spock 6 years ago, and he asks, did you love him? And she said, well, Mr. Spock's feelings were never expressed to me. It is said he has none to give. And Sandoval says, would you like him to stay with us now, to be as one of us? And she smiles knowingly, says, there is no choice, Elias. He must stay. He will stay, in fact. And this is quite a chilling smile that she gives here as we cut to another scene of McCoy examining one of the colonists with his tricorder and his little handheld salt shaker, I think it might have been the original prop. And he thanks the examinee for his time. He says, that'll be all. Kirk enters and says, anything? And McCoy says, I've examined 9 so far, varying in ages from 23 to 59. They're all in perfect condition. Textbook responses, heart, lungs, excellent. Coordination, excellent. Reflexes, excellent. Then a communicator beeps. Spock calls Kirk from a field, and he says there's a total absence of life on the planet, exception of the colonists themselves, and various types of flora. And Kirk confirms that Sulu had the same observation. And Spock goes on to say, I'm conducting various tests with the tricorder, but so far they're inconclusive. And Kirk says, continue investigations, please, and ends the transmission. McCoy comments, it's peculiar there's no animals, especially the fact that the records of the indication did indicate that they had some for breeding and food purposes, but apparently none of them survived. And McCoy says, I'd like to see the medical records. Kirk's prepared for this, and he hands him a tape with it. Sandoval pops in here, and he says to Kirk, I'd like to show you what we've achieved here. And McCoy says, well, I'll have to bow out. I've got the results of the medical investigations to complete, but if I find everyone else's health as good as those I've examined so far, then I might have to retire. And then we cut to Sandoval showing Kirk the soil outside and says, this is the reason for our survival, Captain. This soil will grow anything we plant in it. It's a perfect world. A moderate climate, moderate rains all year round, gives us all we need. He makes no attempt to explain that the Berthold rays have not affected them. DeSalle comes up with a biology report, and Sandoval excuses himself. He says that's true, they got a variety of crops, grains, potatoes, beans, but for an agricultural colony, they actually have very little acreage planted. There's enough to sustain the colony, but very little more. And Kirk comments that it's like a jigsaw puzzle. The mystery deepens. There's another call on the communicator. Kirk answers, and it's McCoy. He wants to see him again, and Kirk says, I'm on my way. Sandoval's medical records show that he registered scar tissue from lobar pneumonia. No major operations, but there was an appendectomy, received all required inoculations, etc., etc., etc. Well, what's so strange about that? And McCoy says, well, nothing, but I examined that man not more than 2 hours ago, but it did not record the scar, and it did record a healthy appendix where one was supposedly removed. So what the heck is going on here? As we cut to Spock in one of the plantation gardens, and he's with Layla, who's just standing smiling at him, and Spock seems frustrated. Nothing, yet your plants grow and you've survived exposure to Berthold rays. And she says, that can be explained. Spock says, please do. And she calmly and soothingly says, later. And Spock gets frustrated here. I've never understood the female capacity to avoid answering a direct question. And she says, I never understood you until now. There's always a place in here, she touches his chest, where no one could enter. There was only the face you allowed people to see. Only one side you'd allow them to. And it's a beautiful exchange, really beautiful exchange. And there's immediate chemistry between the wonderful Jill Ireland and the incredible Leonard Nimoy. I mean, when you consider how Leonard Nimoy was limited in what he had to act with. He had to be a cold and logical being. He did an amazing job expressing reactions, not necessarily emotions. Sometimes emotions, as we know, and we'll get to that in this episode for sure, but reactions more than anything. But this chemistry, the way they just clicked, is just beautiful. And it's a testament to how great these actors were. Both now, sadly, no longer with us, unfortunately. And Spock walks off and says, well, I'd like to know how your people have survived here. But she changes the subject again and says, I missed you. But Spock persists, logically, you should all be dead. And she says, well, if I tell you how we survived, will you try and understand how we feel about our life here? And Spock says, emotions are alien to me. I'm a scientist. And Layla challenges him on that. Others may think that your shipmate's your captain, but you can't fool me. And then she beckons him and says, come, follow me. And she extends her hand. And Spock goes along with it. Clearly reserved, but intrigued. He refuses her hand very, very steadfastly and places his hands behind his back as they walk off. And we cut back to Sandoval and Kirk and McCoy. He's telling Sandoval, I've received orders to evacuate all your personnel within the hour, and we'll have accommodations for you aboard the Enterprise. Sandoval just bluntly says, no, we're not going. And Kirk says, well, it's not an arbitrary decision on my part, sir. I have my orders. Sandoval replies, it's entirely unnecessary. We're in no danger here. McCoy tries to explain about the Berthold rays and their effect. Can't you understand? And our crew are getting very, very frustrated at this lack of apparent awareness. And Sandoval persists, well, you said yourself, your instruments show that we're in perfect health. Well, what about your animals? And Sandoval calmly says that we're vegetarians. And Kirk rightly says, well, that doesn't answer my question. Why did all your animals die? And Sandoval says, well, you stress about very unimportant matters, sir. And Kirk and McCoy, again, look bewildered as Sandoval insists that we will not leave. We go back to Layla and Spock, and she says, not much further. And Spock looks frustrated, saying, well, you've not explained this thing. And she says its basic properties is not important. What is important is what it gives. It's peace, life, and love. And Spock says what you're describing was once known in the vernacular, great word, as the happiness pill. You as a scientist should know that that is not possible. But she persists and beckons him closer to one of these strange plants. And she says, I was one of the first to find them, the spores. As Spock approaches them, and it splatters a powder all over his face. And he reacts surprised at first, and then in pain as he puts his hands to his head, holding his tricorder still. And then he drops his tricorder and bends over in pain and falls to the ground. And Layla says to him, no, it shouldn't hurt, not like this. But Spock says, well, I'm not like you. Then something changes in Spock. And the wonderful, beautiful music that we heard once before in Shore Leave earlier in the season starts playing again. Lovely romantic music. And I actually think it fits this episode better than it did the Shore Leave episode. And she smiles in realization of, you're one of us now. And she says, now you belong to all of us. And Spock reacts as she touches his face gently and she says to him, there's no need to hide your true self any longer. We understand. And Spock clearly is beginning to understand as well. And he reacts and says, as he takes her hand, I love you. I can love you. And she smiles at that because this is what she's been waiting for a long time, since she's had this unrequited love for Spock. And they embrace, and the scene ends as it has them blurred in the background with the spore in the foreground, very, very hauntingly. Then we get a shot of the Enterprise and a captain's log, a supplemental one, reiterating that they've been ordered to evacuate the colony. However, the colony's leader and the colonists have all refused cooperation, as Kirk is following Sandoval out of his farmhouse again, saying, Sandoval, and he cuts him off again. Captain, your arguments are valid, but they don't apply to us. But Kirk persists. My orders are to remove all of the colonists with or without your cooperation, and that's exactly what I intend to do. And Sandoval just casually says, without, I should think, and he walks off. As Sulu approaches with, I think, Kelowitz, he then notices that Spock's absent. Well, where's Mr. Spock and Mr. DeSalle? And Sulu says, we haven't seen them. Gets his communicator out. Love that. Love the sound of the flipping. I used to have one of those somewhere. Might still be kicking around somewhere. But he calls Spock, and Spock's communicator is seen on the grass as Spock has miraculously found a change of clothes. I don't know where from or how he's suddenly in this boiler suit. As he's lying on the ground with Layla stroking his hair, pointing up at the cloud, saying that one looks like a dragon. You see the tail and the dorsal spines, and he looks super chilled. And she says, I've never seen a a dragon, and Spock says, I have on Berengaria 7. He says, I never stopped to look at clouds before, and then he stands and says, or rainbows. And he's got a smile on his face, or it's a peacefulness about him. He says, I can tell you exactly why one appears in the sky, but considering its beauty has always been out of the question. And Layla smiles at him with a beautiful, warm smile that she has. Again, she says, well, not here. And he turns and gives her a very, very loving look as the communicator continues to beep, and they continue to ignore it. And he helps Layla to her feet again, and they embrace once again. Eventually, as the communicator becomes unignorable, Layla picks it up for him, and Spock says, yes. And Kirk says, that doesn't sound right. Spock, is that you? Yes, Captain, what do you want? And Kirk challenges him, what are you doing? And Spock says, I don't believe I want to tell you. And Kirk says, I don't know what you think you're doing, but this is an order. Report back to the settlement within 10 minutes. We're evacuating all colonists to Starbase 27. And Spock says casually, no, I don't think so. And Kirk says, you don't think so what? Spock just says, I don't think so, sir. And Kirk's very bewildered at this point. He says, Spock, report to me immediately. As Spock and Layla, holding the communicator together, close it and drop it to the ground as they continue their embrace. More important things on their minds, for sure. And McCoy rightly says, well, that didn't sound at all like Spock, Jim. And Kirk says, well, no. But I thought you said you might like him if you mellowed it a little. And McCoy says, no, I didn't say that, surely. But they both agree that he might be in trouble. And Kirk says, yes, take over the landing party details, start getting those colonists aboard. I will go and hone in on Mr. Spock's frequency. Contact the cell, have a meet you here, and make sure the landing party works in teams of 2. I don't want anyone alone down here, because it's very clear at this point, Kirk has astutely recognized that something is wrong with Spock, very wrong with Spock, as we cut to a scene where Kirk and Sulu and Kelowitz are homing in on his location. They find his communicator, they pick it up, and then they hear Spock laughing, and Sulu points, and they can see Spock hanging from a tree branch. Most uncharacteristically, uniform changed into this boiler suit jumpsuit, which, again, it's bothering me where the heck he got that from. I don't know where. As Layla is just standing on the ground encouraging him, Kirk looks absolutely stunned and says, Spock. He clears his throat. Mr. Spock. And he starts walking over towards him as we cut back to the landing party detail with colonists seeming to cooperate with starting to pack things up as McCoy's organizing them. We've got more landing party here now. We've got Mr. Leslie is there, DeSalle is there, and he's got some of these spores, and he says jolly happily, I want you to take a good close look at these, Doc. They're very interesting. We cut back to swinging Spock, and he smiles at Kirk and says, you wanted to report to me immediately. Oh, yeah, do you mind? And Spock just smiles at him and said, I didn't want to, Jim. It's wonderful to see Spock like this. It really is. He says, well, yes, I can see that, as Layla just continues smiling knowingly at the situation. And Kirk tries to get some sense out of Layla. He says, Miss Colomi, you'll have to come back to the settlement and prepare to beam up to the ship with us. But Spock interrupts and says, oh, there'll be no evacuation, Jim, but perhaps we better get you back and get you straightened out. Kirk's had enough at this point, and he says, Mr. Spock is under arrest. We get him back to the Enterprise, and Spock just casually jumps down, takes Layla by the hand, and walks off with them. Not a care in the world at this point. And Kirk looks up at the branch and looks very, very confused as they all walk together towards the spores, and the spores spit at what appears to be all 3 of them, Sulu, Kelowitz, and Kirk, but more land on Sulu and Kelowitz. There's only they don't really land on Kirk, actually, if I'm looking more. But Spock immediately says, Mr. Sulu understands, don't you, Mr. Sulu? And Sulu says, yes, I see now. And Kirk realizes he's lost 2 more of his men to whatever is going on here. He says, well, I don't know what these plants are, but everyone's coming back to the ship with me, and we're going to get all these colonists evacuated. As Spock says, I can see the captain is going to be difficult. Why on earth Kirk managed to... Again, it's Kirk is our hero. He must be immortal. He must be invulnerable. It is what it is. Storytelling. We get back to McCoy, and McCoy's clearly been infected, and he's suddenly turned into a very, very southern country doctor, or Georgia doctor, and he says, why don't you just relax, Jimmy boy? And Kirk can see that McCoy's been beaming up the spores. And Kirk's like, oh, how many of those things did you beam up? And Kirk realizes there's an even bigger problem, because if those things have been beamed up with the Enterprise, we have a real issue. And Kirk requests to be beamed up, and beam up he does, and onto the bridge he goes, and he goes to Lieutenant Uhura and asks to be put through to Admiral Comac at Starfleet. And she turns around, and immediately you can see that she's been affected. I'm sorry, sir, I can't do that. Well, what do you mean? Of course, she says it's an order. And she says, well, I know it is, Captain, but all communications are out. And she has sabotaged these deliberately. She short-circuited them, except for ship to surface. They'll need that for a while. And she casually strolls off into the turbo elevator and says, it's really for the best, Captain. And wow, this has happened very quickly. The spores have been beamed up to the ship, and there's one on the bridge, and Kirk goes and he picks it up and he throws it. It, again, doesn't seem to attack him for whatever reason, and he exits the bridge, and it lands right in front of the helm on the floor. And it's a funny-looking thing, that's for sure. And then we get down to the transport room. Kirk goes back down, and he sees a line of people waiting to beam down. We see Lieutenant Hadley's there, Leslie's there, and he gets a speaking line, and he says, I'm sorry, sir, we're all transporting back down to the planet. And he says, well, get back to your station. And Leslie says, no. And he says, this is a mutiny, mister. And Leslie says, yes, sir, it is. And end scene, Kirk's doing another log saying the spores have influenced all of his crew. He doesn't know why his mind hasn't been infected, but they seem to have spread through the ventilation system. But he says, nor can I get Dr. McCoy to explain the physical and physiological aspects of the infection. And he communicates with McCoy again. He says, I'm not interested in any physical or physiological aspects. We're all perfectly healthy down here, Jim. And Kirk, the only one not affected now, at a communication station, saying, perfect, yeah, that's the word I keep on hearing. It says, I bet you even grew your tonsils back, didn't you? And McCoy says, sure enough. Hey, Jim boy, you ever had a real cold Georgia-style mint julep, huh? And I'm just loving this McCoy here. He's just hamming it up with his Georgia country doctor accent there, and Kirk's trying to get him to cooperate, and McCoy's just not interested. He chuckles and says, who wants to counteract paradise, Jimmy boy? McCoy out. Exits the bridge again, and on the planet we can see tea being poured, and Sandoval is pleased, talking to Spock that the entire landing operation is proceeding quite well. We've got nearly all the crew down. Kirk comes in and says, where's McCoy? And Spock says, he went off to create something called a mint julep. That's a drink, Jim. Spock is so mellow here, and Sandoval's like, why don't you come join us in our own private paradise? The spores have made it that. Kirk asks where did they originate, and Spock says it's impossible to say. They drifted through space until finally they landed here, and they actually thrive on Berthold rays. So Spock has the first explanation, and they act as a repository for thousands of microscopic species until they find a place to inhabit. And in return, they give you complete health and peace of mind. And Kirk asks, is that paradise? It's a question. And Sandoval says, we have no need or want. It's a true Eden, Jim. There's belonging and love. It's hard to argue with that. No wants, no needs. And Kirk says, we weren't meant for that. None of us. A man stagnates if he has no ambition, no desire to be more than he is. Sandoval again persists. We have what we need, except for the challenge. And Spock says, you don't understand, Jim. But you'll come around sooner or later. Join us, please. They persist. They really want him to join them. And Kirk says, I have to go back to the ship. And he's betting a lot on there being people back on the ship to beam him back up at this point. But obviously there must have been, because we cut to the ship, an empty bridge. Kirk arrives on that empty bridge, and he looks very lonely, and it is very lonely. And it's a desperate situation. It really, really is. And watching this episode, it's hard to know what side to be on, because Kirk is right. Humankind does stagnate without the challenge, without that desire to improve oneself and be better and grow, a growth mindset. But what is wrong with paradise at the same time? Is there a right or wrong answer here as Kirk steps down to his command chair, presses a button, calls around the ship? Engineering, Scotty, are you there? Biochemistry lab, security, anyone? Is anyone aboard? But there isn't. He's the last one. And he was very lucky to get back on the ship. The last transporter operator must have just beamed him back up before there was no one left to do it. And he sits in his command chair looking almost defeated. He clearly doesn't know what to do at this point as he presses a button on his chair, and he starts a captain's log. Except for myself, all crew personnel have transported to the surface of the planet. Mutinied. Lieutenant Uhura has effectively sabotaged the communications station. I can only contact the surface of the planet. The ship can be maintained for several months in orbit, but even with automatic controls, I cannot pilot her alone. I am, in effect, marooned here. And he stands up and he moves down and sits in the helm position. And at this point, you don't see the spore that he threw earlier on the floor, so that's a continuity error because it's for sure there, as we'll see in a moment. And he continues the log. He says, I'm beginning to realize just how big this ship really is, how quiet. I don't know how to get my crew back, how to counteract the effect of the spores. I don't know, he says, what I can offer against a paradise. And he's lost here. He doesn't know what to do. And it's great seeing this vulnerability in Kirk. Genuine vulnerability, not knowing what to do as he puts his hand to his face, and he's lost, just completely lost. And the spore then appears in front of the helm, rises up and blasts him. And he's covered in the dust, as everyone else was. And he gets affected immediately, just like everyone else did. And he smiles, and he's got the realization now. He understands, and he contacts the surface. And he says, Enterprise to Mr. Spock, it's Jim, joined you, I understand now. And Spock's really delighted, as is Layla. And he says, wonderful, Jim. When will you beam down? He says, there's some things in my quarters I want to pack. And Spock says, good. Layla and I will meet you at the beam down point. And Kirk ends the transmission. And we see him go down to his quarters. He packs a suitcase, which has his green wraparound tunic in. I'm not quite sure why he's doing this. Why he's packing uniforms. If he's given up and ready to join, why is he packing uniforms? That's really strange. But he's got a smile on his face as he's in his quarters, but there's something in him still making him pause, and this comes back to Kirk being that super duper mega human, the one who cannot be beaten, the one who's immune to everything, which is what makes him captain, I guess. And he opens his medal from a cabinet, and he looks at it for a second, smiling at it. A mixture of emotions, I think. Happiness, recollection, but ultimately he slams it shut, picks up his suitcase, and he goes to the transporter room. So he's clearly conflicted already. The transporter room is in darkness. The ship is on minimal power here as he puts his suitcase on the transporter panel, and he gets ready to transport himself down to the planet. And this is where the fight in Kirk comes to a head as he starts activating the transporter controls. And the real him inside begins fighting the spores. No. And he gets angry. He says, I can't leave. And he thumps the panel again. And then he has a moment of, and it snaps him out of it. He has defeated the spores, and he realizes immediately emotions. Violent emotions, needs, anger. And that's the answer. He's found the answer. Absolutely a moment of revelation. Super Kirk has beaten what everyone else, all other 429 people on the ship couldn't do. And he has prevailed against the spores and overcome them. And he does a supplemental captain's log and says, I think I've discovered the answer, and confirms what he plans to do. My plan contains considerable risk, and that Mr. Spock is much stronger than the average human being, and that aroused his great physical strength could kill. And that is true, but it is a risk that he's going to have to take if he's going to execute his plan. And he contacts Spock again on the planet, and he says, Spock here, what's keeping you, Jim? We've been waiting, as Layla smiles beside him, holding hands. And Kirk says, I realize that there's some equipment we have here that should be down at the settlement. And once I beam down, we won't be able to beam anyone up. Will you come up here and help me? And he says, well, just a moment. And then he reassures Layla, well, this won't take long. Do you mind? And she says, no, I'll wait. And she kisses him, and off Spock goes. And he says, ready to beam up, Jim. And that was too easy. Surely Spock should have suspected something. But I don't know. Maybe he was too lost in his happiness that he didn't. And Spock is beamed up, and Kirk has armed himself with a metal club, and he greets him immediately saying, all right, you mutinous, disloyal, computerized half-breed, we'll see about you deserting my ship. And Spock looks puzzled. The term half-breed is somewhat applicable, but computerized is inaccurate. A machine can be computerized, not a man. Kirk says, what makes you think you're a man? You're an overgrown jackrabbit, an elf with an hyperactive thyroid. And Spock laughs at him, says, Jim, I don't understand. Kirk says, of course you don't understand. All you have is printed circuits. And Spock says, Captain, if you excuse me, as he tries to beam back down again. He says, what can you expect from a simpering, devil-eared freak whose father was a computer and his mother an encyclopedia? And Spock says, my mother was a teacher, my father an ambassador. And Kirk says, your father was a computer like his son, and he's trying to get a reaction out of Spock. An ambassador from a planet of traitors. The Vulcan never lived who had an ounce of integrity. And Spock's starting to get irritated here. Agitated, Captain, please. And Kirk goes on, you're disloyal to the core, rotten like the rest of your subhuman race, and you've got the gall to make love to that girl. And Spock says, that's enough. Clearly getting more and more irritated. And Kirk goes on, does she know what she's getting, Spock? A carcass full of memory banks who should be squatting on a mushroom. Instead of passing himself off as a man, you belong in a circus, Spock, not a starship. And Spock's getting more and more wound up. And Kirk goes on, right next to the dog-faced boy. Some choice phrases coming out of Kirk's mouth here as Spock unleashes and whacks the metal bar. And again, we get wide-shot stunt doubles that are clearly not Shatner and Nimoy, but nevertheless, it's a short exchange in which Kirk is easily overwhelmed by Spock with his superior strength, and Spock hovers over Kirk holding a stool or something, and then he snaps out of it, just as Kirk did. And Kirk says, had enough? I didn't realize what it took to get under that thick hide of yours. Anyway, I don't know what you're so mad about. It isn't every first officer who gets to belt his captain several times as he reaches for his face in pain. And Spock, back to his normal self, says, you did that to me deliberately, didn't you? Kirk says, believe me, Mr. Spock, it was a painful decision in more ways than one, as he now clutches his arm, selling the injuries in true wrestling fashion. Spock says, I don't belong anymore. Kirk says, you said they were benevolent and peaceful. Violent emotions overwhelm them and destroy them. I had to make you angry enough to shake off their influence. That's the answer, Mr. Spock. And Spock agrees. That may be correct, Captain. But trying to initiate a brawl with over 500 crewmen? 500 crewmen and colonists. Yeah, maybe there is that many. I don't know, I'll have to do the maths. But Kirk then says, can you put together a subsonic transmitter of some sort and broadcast it over the communication channels? And Spock says, yes, it can be done. And Kirk says, good, let's go to work. And Spock pauses and says, Captain, striking a fellow officer is a court-martial offence. And Kirk acknowledges this, but comments that, well, if we're both in the brig, who's going to build the subsonic transmitter? And Spock nods and says, well, that is quite logical, Captain. And it is. And it's a nice little moment of Kirk and Spock. Back on the planet, McCoy comes over to Layla and he says, it's a little early to be counting stars, Miss Layla. And she says she's waiting for the Captain and Mr. Spock to beam down. They've got some equipment, but that needs to be beamed down. But it's been so long, and I wish he'd come back. And McCoy says, well, I think I can fix that for you. And he calls the Enterprise and his communicator in a very mellow way, the Enterprise, and Spock's on the bridge and he answers the signal, and Spock's back in uniform now. Enterprise, Spock here. And Layla starts talking to him. He says, it's Layla. I borrowed the Doctor's communicator. And she's truly a very, very gentle person, the way she portrays this character. It's a wonderful performance. And Spock looks bothered. She says, you're all right, aren't you? And he says, yes. But he's cold. And he replies, yes, I'm quite well. Well, Layla immediately knows something is wrong. He says, can I come aboard? I've never seen a starship before, and I want to talk to you. He asks, are you still at the beam down point, and is the Doctor there? And she says yes to both questions. And Spock says, give your communicator back to Dr. McCoy. You won't need it to beam up. It'll take a few moments. I always thought you did need a communicator to beam up, but oh well. Kirk then says to Spock, Mr. Spock, Miss Kolomi is strictly your concern, but should you talk to her while she's still under the influence of the spores? And Spock acknowledges and replies, I'll be back shortly, Captain. He knows that he has to do this. He owes her this, affected by the spores or not. And off he goes to the transporter room. And he gets ready to beam her up. He pulls those 3 little red switches which make that delicious noise that I've always loved. I can't even do that noise justice with my approximation of it. And Spock, the emotions that we know he has are definitely playing on his face here, because we know he has emotions. He just conceals them well. And he walks over to her as she launches off the transporter pad into his arms and embraces him, but she knows immediately that he's gone. She says, you're no longer with us, are you? And she begs him, come back to the planet. You can belong again. Spock said, it was necessary. And this is a wonderful scene that comes here. Layla is devastated because she had the man that she truly loved, that she truly had unrequitedly loved for many, many years. And now she had him. And she begs him, please come back. And he says, I can't. And she's utterly in despair here. And she reiterates that she loves him. And she said it 6 years ago. And she can't seem to stop repeating herself as she cries. She says, on Earth, you couldn't give anything of yourself. You couldn't even put your arms around me. And it's a really heartbreaking moment, and it's well acted. She says we couldn't have anything together there, and we couldn't have anything together anyplace else. It's wonderful dialogue, and it's delivered beautifully. She turns back to him, but we're happy here. I can't lose you now, Mr. Spock. I can't. And Spock replies, I have a responsibility to this ship, to that man on the bridge. I am what I am, Layla. Pop out the sailor man. And if there are self-made purgatories, then we all have to live in them. Mine can be no worse than anyone else's. And Layla says, I have lost you, haven't I? And she's coming to realize it. She's coming to accept it. Not only you, she realizes, I've lost all of it. The spores, because her emotions, her feelings of despair and upset, has cured her of them too. And Spock tells her the captain discovered that strong emotions and needs destroy the spore influence. And she says, and this is for my good. And she's kind of got a point. This is one of those episodes where you can see both sides of it. And she says, do you mind if I say that I still love you? And she embraces him again. And I think Spock does have feelings for her. I really, really believe that he does. And then she asks him, you never told me if you had another name, Mr. Spock. And he almost smiles at her. And he actually strokes her on the face, really showing that he does care for her. And he says to her, you couldn't pronounce it. Which is interesting, because this is the only reference that I can ever recall in all of Star Trek where it's indicated that Spock has another name that isn't just Spock. Well, what a wonderful scene. Really powerful. Possibly my favorite scene in the episode. Real amazing acting, genuine emotion as we cut back to the bridge, and Kirk and Spock are at work underneath the science station getting ready with the supersonic signal that will cure everybody. And on the planet, we see people digging. It's Sulu and Desal, and things are starting to take effect as they get irritated with each other, as they bump into each other, and they start fighting each other with the shovels and fall to the ground and start tumbling around, and it's definitely working. There are fights breaking out all over the settlement, and the plan is going into effect. Very, very much so. Sandoval approaches Dr. McCoy, who's sat under a tree, sipping his mint julep, which looks very, very nice, actually, to be fair. And Sandoval says to him, well, Doctor, I've been thinking about what sort of work I can assign you to. And McCoy, quite agitatedly, says, what do you mean? I'm a doctor. And Sandoval says, well, not anymore, of course. We don't need you as a doctor. And McCoy stands up and says, oh, no? Would you like to see just how fast I can put you in a hospital? And there's hostility definitely brewing between them. And it escalates, and Sandoval tries to hit McCoy. McCoy expertly dodges him with his military training and punches him in the stomach, lays him out. And he looks at the mint julep. He snapped back into himself and realizes, and he says, sorry, Sandoval, I don't know what made me do that. As they're all starting to come back to their senses, including Sandoval, who nurses his chin. I'm sure he punched him in the stomach. Maybe I didn't see that. And he immediately realizes, we've done nothing here. We've achieved nothing. No accomplishments, no progress. 3 years wasted. We wanted to make this place a garden. And McCoy says, you can't stay here. You can't survive without the spores. And that's true. The Berthold rays will get them if the spores aren't there. And McCoy says, after you've cleared the starbase, you could be relocated. Depends upon what you want. And Sandoval says, I think we'd like to get some work done. And they're back on mission. They want to start doing the work that they plan to do, as McCoy calls the ship. And Spock acknowledges, and Sandoval will want to talk to the captain. And Spock says to Jim, they're all beginning to call in, Captain. And Kirk has a smile on his face. But Sandoval wants to speak to you. And he puts him on the speaker. You were to transport us to Starbase 27, Captain. We'll give you every cooperation. And Kirk happily says, start making preparations, Mr. Sandoval. We'll begin transporting your people aboard as soon as more of our crew checks in. We come to the end of the episode. Wonderful shot of the Enterprise, close up, orbiting Omicron Ceti 3. Everything's back to normal on the bridge. People back at their stations. McCoy walks into the bridge. Kirk is at his command chair with Spock next to him, writing on a report. And the colonists have all been examined. They're all in absolutely perfect health, he tells Kirk. They see the reverse of the planet as they leave orbit. And McCoy says, that's the second time man's been thrown out of paradise. And Kirk says, no, Bones, this time we walked out on our own. Maybe we weren't meant for paradise. Maybe we We're meant to fight our way through, to struggle, to claw our way up. And Kirk says, we haven't heard much from you about Omicron 33, Mr. Spock. Spock says, I have little to say about it, Captain, except that for the first time in my life, I was happy. And the episode ends. Directed by Ralph Sanevsky, teleplay by the wonderful DC Fontana, produced by Gene L. Kuhn. And off goes the Enterprise. Executive producer, the great bird of the galaxy himself, Gene Roddenberry. The end credits roll. What do we got? Let's have a see. Guest star Jill Ireland, wonderful. Frank Overton, who I'm presuming played Sandoval. DeForest Kelly. We've got, it was Kellowitz. Grant Woods as Kellowitz. Now, I thought it was him, but he looked a bit different for some reason. Maybe he's had lighter hair or something, but I had a feeling from memory it was Kellowitz. George Takei as Sulu, Nichelle Nichols as Uhura, we've got Michael Barrier as DeSalle, Dick Scotter as Painter, who was at navigation, and Eddie Paskey simply as crewman, or we know him as Mr. Leslie, of course. Music in this episode composed and conducted by Alexander Courage, and script consultant DC Fontana. Special credit for DC Fontana in this particular episode. Taking a look at IMDb at this episode, let's have a look, see what we've got. There we go, all of the credits that we've just seen. But some lovely photos there of the episode. Let's have a look at the top cast, everyone that we've just seen there. Jill Ireland as Layla Kalomi, Frank Overton as Elias Sandoval. Let's just click on Jill Ireland there for a moment and have a look at her, 1936 to 1990. And there's Charles Bronson there. And she was best known for this episode of Star Trek and for her many supporting roles in the movies of Charles Bronson, also known for her battle with breast cancer, having written 2 books on her fight with the disease and serving as a spokesperson for the American Cancer Society. Let's just have a little bit more of a look at her biography. Born in 1936 in London, England, and died in May 1990 in Malibu, California. And now this I didn't know. She was married to David McCallum, famous for The Man from U.N.C.L.E., and separated from him in 1966. And then she did actually marry Charles Bronson, who was 15 years her senior. The other thing that I remember her being in, as a fan of the great British series of films called the Carry On films, she appeared in Carry On Nurse, the second ever Carry On film, as visitor to a patient in the hospital. I think she visited Kenneth Williams, which she was lovely in that as well. She always just came across as such a lovely person. Anyway, Frank Overton there, Grant Woods as Kellowitz, Sulu, Uhura, DeSalle, Painter, Eddie Paskey, Bobby Bass as Lieutenant, Billy Blackburn as Hadley there, Brent was in there, Carrie Foster as Enterprise crew member. This face she's appearing a lot. I've got to find out who she is. The transporter chief there, John Lyndall Smith as engineer, and Jeannie Malone as yeoman. Let's have a look. We got some scores here. 7.8 for this particular episode. I am going to score this. I don't think I can score it here because I'm not logged in, I don't think, but I'll do it on my iPhone later. I'm going to score this an 8 because I think it's absolutely superb. What a wonderful rewatch. I always enjoy watching that one. It's a great episode. It deserves its absolutely at minimum 8 score. I might even be tempted to give it more, 8.5, or even maybe not a 9, maybe 8.5, but it's solid. It's got outdoor locations. It's got a good plot. It's got drama. It's got love. It's got a bit of comedy here and there as well with McCoy's Georgia Mint Julep. And oh my gosh, just so much that I like about this episode. It has spoken words from Eddie Paskey as Mr. Leslie. It's got Spock falling in love with the wonderful, beautiful late Jill Ireland, who I think just brought so much warmth to that character. And everything I've ever seen her in, she brought so much heart and warmth into all the roles she ever played. I really loved her, and I was so devastated that she died before her time. And yeah, some of the things about the episode that maybe jump out at me a little bit in the negative sense are that Kirk, as usual, is the one that manages to, as we said in Space Seed, be the last one to be conscious, or in this case, the one who overcomes the spores. He discovers the cure because he's the superhero, but, you know, it's a plot device. It's meant to show just what a character he is, and it works, it fits. It's a little bit roll your eyes, but it's also, you know, I can accept it. It does raise questions of do human beings want or need paradise, or do they need challenges to thrive? And it's an interesting one, isn't it? I mean, without purpose, I get a little bored, but I often, when I'm stressed and busy, I yearn for the countryside and trees and greenery and peace and quiet. And maybe it's what we need as balance. Maybe we need not one or the other, but we need a bit of both, that harmony, though, that fusion of those two things. So I think maybe that's the answer, but some good points from both sides on that argument, and some good reactions to when they were freed from the spores as well. The music that they played, the love theme that, as I said, was first seen in Shore Leave when Kirk imagined Ruth on the Shore Leave planet. I love that piece of music so much. It's so beautiful. And I think it works better here than in any other episode in which it's used. And I think it's used one more time in Star Trek, which I think is in the season 2 episode called The Apple, where it's used very briefly. But yeah, good stuff. Final appearance in there from Kelowitz, I think. That was his 3. I think he appeared in Galileo 7 and Arena, and this one I think we're done with Kelowitz, played by Grant Woods. DeSalle, we're going to see more from him. This was the second, I think, of 3 from him. He's in a season 2 episode. And yeah, I think that's just about all I can think to say. Love it. Yeah, let me know what you think of this episode in the comments. Do you like it? Do you hate it? You're in between? Is it just there? What would you score it? What did you think? On that note, we'll wind up another episode. We'll see you next time as we get towards the real end of season 1. We're starting to get through these again after my little break. You all take care. Stay safe. Do travel well and live well and prosper. Bye-bye.